The Sarah Larson Lecture Series Committee would like to invite you to our lecture, our last lecture semester. Dystopian Futures Now, Anxiety in the Age of Uncertainty, on Thursday, April 9th from 1 to 2:15 at the Dunwoody campus, C11. That's a C auditorium. Maybe you know where the C auditorium is in the C building. It's the biggest room on the campus, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe the gymnasium is bigger, but I taught a class there one time when my classroom was being renovated. They pushed me out the auditorium because it was empty. So I taught about 15 students in a huge auditorium. Anyway, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. All right. Now, anybody else have any questions, comments? Okay, 2 persons have turned in their papers early, and some of you, I mean, hey, believe me, I have a record of it, not turning your first paper. If you will check on iCollege, with you being accepted, I did not put your grade on iCollege yet, but if you check on iCollege, if I don't have a grade for you for the first paper, that means I never received it. And by way of reminder, I really want you to deal with one issue about the bodies. Were they interred? In other words, buried deliberately by their friends or relatives, or were they just simply covered over with dust? And I want you to deal with that issue. All right. And I will count off points if you don't, because I say that in the instructions. Okay. I'm just curious, how many of you started on your next project yet? Okay, several of you, yeah. Don't be afraid to take a stance that you think I might disagree with, but folks, the issue is not which side of the issue you take. The issue is logic. Do you really prove your point? To me, that's important. All right. With that out of the way, we'll start on our lesson on Africa. I talked to a teacher when I first started in here some 14 and a half years ago, who told me that she did not teach African history. Well, I don't skip any chapters at all. I mean, well, the first couple of semesters I taught, I skipped a few chapters, but then I decided, hey, I need to learn this along with you, so anymore I don't skip chapters. Going over this one. One of the points I want to start off with is, even ever since I was a child, it seemed to me like the study of Africans reminded me a lot of the study of the American Indians. The American Indians and Africans were tribal peoples, and in religion they worshipped a whole lot of spirits, very similar. And then as I studied both of them, I realized they're even more similar than I thought, because in both cases, the people that the Europeans met in the 14 and 1500s were actually descended from much more advanced peoples, that Africa actually is believed to have led the way towards civilization. And furthermore, Africa was more important in world affairs than we realized. For instance, if Sir Lancelot existed at all, Sir Lancelot would have wielded an iron sword and had iron armor and an iron shield. If he existed at all and had any of these things, most likely the iron he used would have come from Africa. Africa has more of the world's natural resources than any other continent on Earth. More things, particularly strong in tin, gold, diamonds, iron, yes, especially iron, and ivory. Now, let's say ivory. Who knows, where does ivory come from? Elephant tusks. The hunting of ivory is now illegal, because the world will run out of elephants if we allow it. But we have synthetic materials now that will take the place of ivory. Piano keys used to be made out of ivory, but now we have synthetic materials that will do the job just as well. About Africa, only 1/3 of Africa is jungle. But pardon me, only a small part, not 1/3, only a small part of Africa's jungle. The reason I bring this up is my first impression of Africa. I was about 6 years old, and I was playing games with my brother and some other 6-year-olds, and this fellow, I remember his name was Bud. He said Africa's just a jungle. Yeah, well, actually only a small part of it is jungle. The jungle, such as it is mostly in the area around the Congo, right in here. Not very much else of Africa is jungle. The biggest desert in the world is this desert right here, the Sahara. It's also has the hottest temperatures on Earth. There are also deserts down here, so a very high percentage of Africa is desert. Over here in the east part of Africa is a whole lot of grasslands, which we call savannas. And when I say grass, I don't mean grass like the grass that the cattle around here graze on. I mean grasses that are taller than your heads. And you don't, unless you've had proper training, you never want to step inside these grasses because you can stick out your hand and can't even see your hand. The grasses will wrap around and close in on you. And unless you've had training, you go in the grasses and you'll never find your way out. It is known that when people walk, 99% of us walk, taking one foot with bigger steps than the other, and we wind up, without even knowing we're doing it, we wind up circling around and going the opposite direction. That's why when I was in the Army, they trained you, pick an object like a tree or some building, and align yourself with that to make sure you're walking in a straight line, and align yourself with two other trees. Otherwise, you're going to walk in a circle and find yourself right back where you started from. But anyway, if you're getting stuck in the grass and you can't see anything, well, unless you have instruments or unless you have some kind of training, you'll never find your way out of tall, tall grasslands. All right. The jungles of Africa are also, where they're located, they're very, very thick, dense jungles with rumors floating around that dinosaurs have been seen in the jungles and expeditions have been sent to try to find them. And some of them have found some really interesting stuff. The big beasts, if they exist, seem to know where to hide. All right. The eastern part of Africa, right in here, is called Safari Country. This is where the game hunters used to go to back when the hunting African game was a pastime, and the hunters would kill things like wild beasts and try to kill even elephants and other of Africa's wild animals. It's also believed that mankind had its beginnings right here in the eastern part of Africa in Kenya. Again, whether or not you actually believe that will depend on your worldview, but according to today's anthropologists, the first humans came forth right here in the East African region of Kenya, and then eventually, of course, spread out all over the globe. At one time, we knew nothing about the history of Africa, and when Europeans encountered them, we thought, hey, these people have no history. Well, they did have a history, and they do, and this history is slowly being constructed. Now, I studied African history a little bit when I was in college, and what we've learned since in the last 40 years or so has changed a few things. We study African history by studying their trails, archaeology, their artwork. A lot of their artwork found its way into the desert, and the dry desert has preserved a lot of it to where a lot of it is in a remarkably good state of preservation. And we also learned that these people did have some very large cities. They had some urban metropolitan areas that by the time the Europeans arrived, they had largely abandoned. Again, reminding me of what you see a lot in North and South America. And we'll run into again when we come to the section on the Southeast Asia. A lot of peoples who lived in the jungles, particularly in the tropical jungles, would eventually abandon their civilization. Why? Because when you're civilized and you have a little bit of wealth, you're surrounded by a bunch of barbaric neighbors who want that wealth, and they'll find some way to harass you until they get it. And Your barbaric neighbors will much too often unite with other barbaric tribes to try to seize what you have. Could the same thing happen in the United States? I think definitely yes. But these people, I think that there's been many books written on why civilizations fall, but I think the big reason is civilizations fall from within before outside enemies come and sense their weakness and conquer them from without, or force them to leave their civilized life and go live in a jungle, in a wilderness, and abandon their civilized ways.
What do you mean the same thing happened in the United States?
Could we, 200 or 300 years from now, become a land of run-down, crumbled-up cities, of run-over, crumbled-up roads that are grown over by weeds, where the people living here are living in tents, wigwams, teepees, and making a living by hunting and fishing? Seems unreal, seems impossible. Basically, this has happened to many a person, many a time, and many a civilization. The people wind up abandoning their civilized ways and go out. Hey, I mean, it was a fad when I was a kid, and it's still going on. A lot of young people, hopefully I'm not talking to any of you, but are deciding, hey, the price of civilization is too great. I'm going to go someplace like Belize, or someplace where I can just live a life of farming and not have to be completely independent of the whole economic system, not have to worry about money, not have to worry about the stock market or the banking account. And I know of a person who did this, and they went to Belize, and there in Belize, a whole bunch of big flies, I mean huge flies, the size of silver dollars, started biting at them and sucking their blood. And they became so infected. And the local people, the flies don't bother them. They're resistant to it. They developed immunity. And they finally had to leave Belize because the life there was just too miserable. Again, you might know somebody like this. But if we have too many people who develop this attitude that we'd rather live a primitive life and decide to drop out. And a lot of the young people in my generation thought they wanted to. Again, some of you may have heard the hippie movement, the hippies who would not take a bath. Most of them wound up, and I say them because I was not one of them, wound up adopting the values of society and becoming useful, productive citizens. Some of them did not. But again, people develop attitudes of, oh, I don't like this civilized life with its high taxes, its requirements, where I just have to get up and go to work whether I want to or not. Try working for yourself. And I can name you a friend of mine who quit Lockheed. He only quit for 4 years, and I wanted to go into business himself. In business for himself, he did not get any paid vacations. He did not get any paid sick time off. After 4 years, he came back to Lockheed. His business, by the way, failed. His workers did not work as hard as he wanted them to, and he didn't know how to motivate them to work any harder. He finally just laid them all off, sold his tools, and he went into the car repair and sold his tools and went back to work at Lockheed as a mechanical engineer. This, folk, you'll run into, but if you haven't already. But a lot of civilized people down through the ages have lost their civilized ways for many and varied reasons, and been overrun by people that we might call barbarians or uncivilized people. Now, the Africans, the older Africans, did have some writings, and we have found some of their writings, but their writings have not been deciphered. And I can't emphasize enough, it's owing to the fact we simply don't have enough of them. We know in the case of at least Axum, the one civilization that lived right here in southern Egypt, they initially wrote in hieroglyphics like the Egyptians did. We can decipher some of that because they copied Egyptian writing. But then they started writing in alphabetic script, and we can't read that. Again, we probably could decipher if we had more writings, but to decipher an ancient script, you have to have a lot of writing. We also dig up their history by studying their trade routes, their trails, and they also pass their history down by what's called oral tradition. Pass the history down from one generation to the next. the African young people would gather around campfires, and an old man would tell them a story about sometimes it was a story about what happened to him as a young man, but sometimes it was a story about what had happened, what he had been told by his ancestors or by his parents. And they would pass down their histories, and there are persons now who believe these histories. They're going around and trying to collect them. Some African people tried to memorize the names of their ancestors back for at least 50 generations. That took something like more than 2,000 years, to about 1,500 to 2,000 years. And they'd memorized the names of their ancestors. And if we can believe or find out how much of these stories we can believe, but again, if you know anything at all about the game of gossip, start a rumor on this side of the room, by the time it gets over here, the story can oftentimes be completely changed or altered to where it doesn't even mean the same thing that it did originally. But we are trying to reconstruct Africa's history. And one of the things that we have found out is they did have civilizations, several of them, but all these civilizations fell by the wayside. And when it was over with, mostly all that was left was Bantu people. The Berbers who lived up here along the Mediterranean, or the Bantu, the Bantu people came from West Africa, migrated to the east, and largely took over east. And one reason I believe the Bantu were so successful was they had a lot of children. They had a large population increase, whereas a lot of the rest of the African people seem to have not been as prolific in populating. All right, where were the first civilizations in Africa? The first one is what your books call the Kush, Kingdom of Kush. Now that name can be spelled with a C or a K. By the way, this name is found in the Bible. Grandson of Noah, son of Noah's son Ham, is named Cush. Cush, the Cushites were first called Nubians, and their kingdom is in what is today southern Egypt. We know that Egypt and Nubia influenced each other, but in fact, we really don't even know which kingdom was first. Were the Nubians first, or the Egyptians first? Both developed pyramids. However, the Nubian pyramids were rarely more than 6 feet high, really tiny compared to the Egyptian pyramids. And both of them developed agriculture. The Nubians may have taught the whole world the arts of agriculture. Without agriculture, people are left to hunting and fishing, food gathering, just going out in the forest or the wilderness and gathering what food they can find. Agriculture includes domestication of plants and animals, where you grow the crops you need, and also tame the animals you need. And it's a more dependable source of food than hunting and fishing. You go out hunting, maybe the whole tribe, all the men of the tribe might go out on a hunting trip, stay 2 or 3 days, and come home empty-handed. Where's all the game? We don't know. We never saw any. And same with fishermen. You can get on your boats, go out fishing, fish for 2 or 3 days, and sometimes catch absolutely nothing. But life is more dependable when you raise the animals you eat, the goats, the sheep, the cattle. Egypt conquered Nubia for a while. Then Nubia turned around and conquered Egypt for a while. In other words, one of the dynasties of Egypt was a black African dynasty. The Assyrians up here rose up, and they drove the Nubians out of Egypt and forced them to live farther south, closer south. And Nubia eventually fell by the wayside. It was the Nubians that had the hieroglyphic writing that apparently was a copy of Egyptian writing. Then they developed an alphabetic script that we have not been able to decipher. Now, the Nubians also traded, and all these civilizations along the eastern coast of Africa were traders, and they traded with the Far East, and they were helped by a unique situation only have in one place in the world. The winds blow eastward for 6 months, then the winds turn around and blow westward for 6 months. So your sea captains had to guess when the winds were starting to blow east, they would spread out their sails and they would head east, and they would head toward India, and some of them went beyond India into Malaysia, and even as far as China, the Philippines, these East Indies islands. Then, when the winds shifted, the captains would again furl out their sails and sail back west. This trade went on for thousands of years and enriched both Africa and the Far East. It is known that the Chinese sent large ships to Africa, and one emperor was really impressed when they sent a fleet of very large ships, 400-foot long wooden sailboats, and these ships came back with elephants and giraffes. The emperor was especially impressed with the giraffe because animals like the giraffe are found nowhere else, at least not found in China. So the emperor was quite impressed. Now, another kingdom that came up after Cush was the kingdom of Axum. Eventually, Axum rose up and conquered Cush. Axum was located right here along the coast of the Red Sea, but south of Egypt. But right across the Red Sea was the kingdom of Saba. Your authors believe that Saba, that one of the rulers of Saba was the Queen of Sheba mentioned in the Bible, the Queen of Sheba who visited Solomon. I had a student do a paper on that, I believe, 2 or 3 semesters ago. Personally, I suspect, even though I'm not prepared to prove it because I can't, the Queen of Sheba was Queen Hatshepsut, that the Jews mistook the name Sheba for Hatshepsut. And actually, she was the queen of Egypt. Josephus said as much himself. Josephus, who lived shortly after the time of Christ, said that the queen of Sheba was the queen of Egypt, which we guess to be the queen of Hatshepsut. Nevertheless, your book's authors seem to think that Saba was located right here, and a queen from here visited King Solomon. According to the Ethiopian account, the queen of Sheba and Solomon had a son named Menelik. And Menelik's descendants were destined to rule Ethiopia until 1974, when the last one was deposed. The last ruler was a man named Haile Selassie. Likely none of you, have any of you heard of Haile Selassie? Okay, one of you. I think most of you, if you'd have grown up an idea, you probably would have heard of him. He made world news several times, but then he was deposed in 1974, and he died a deposed person. Haile Selassie was very, very popular among African people, even among the Africans living in the West Indies. They worshipped him. I knew that. I was not going to mention it, but it's okay if you mention it. I didn't know that. They worshipped him. I had a brother who spent some time in Jamaica, and Haile Selassie visited Jamaica one time, and some of the Jamaicans were upset because he was lighter in color than they anticipated. I don't know why he would not have been completely black, but he was lighter than they anticipated, and they left disappointed in him. But he was looked on as being a god by a lot of Africans, worshipped as such. And anyway, he claimed that he was descended from Solomon and Solomon's son Menelik, and Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And supposedly had a son named Menelik. I'll mention this now too. Supposedly Menelik stole the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant has been hidden away in Ethiopia ever since, which helps to explain why Italy here had so much interest in Ethiopia. Italy tried to conquer Ethiopia in the 1890s and failed because the Italian troops could not handle the venomous snakes that the natives seemed to not be bothered with. And also that they couldn't handle the deserts, and if that weren't enough, the British gave the Ethiopians high-powered weapons with which the Ethiopians used to drive the Italians out. But then Italy conquered Ethiopia in 1936, But when the war was over and Italy lost, Italy was told, you must get back Ethiopia. Ethiopia was to remain a Christian kingdom. Ethiopia embraced Christianity when Christianity came in. It remained a Christian kingdom until the communists took over in 1974. Is that basically what you would
They didn't conquer all of Ethiopia,
just a small part?
just Eritrea that used to be part of Ethiopia.
Okay. What's the rest of it? Still Ethiopia?
Well, Ethiopia's never really had like anybody colonized or conquered it. Like
That is true. And that's what I'm about to mention.
just that portion by the Red Sea.
Just the portion by the Red Sea here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ethiopia has, during the centuries, it managed to resist Islam. Resisted Islam for some 1,300 years, and of course resisted Italy. Italy, like I say, well, it held them for a few years before they had to give it up. And Ethiopia is still there. Ethiopia is about the only country I know of that started out here south of Egypt, but gradually and slowly moved here, partly because of the desert. The desert kept expanding and still does expand. But Ethiopia moved into the mountains, and these mountains make it difficult for outside armies to come in and conquer. Not to mention the harsh climate, poisonous snakes, and the insects that the Ethiopians seem to have immunity to. And the outsiders, there was something else too about Islamic conquerors. They do not do very well when they can't get on their mounted horses and just swoop down and overtake you. I cannot imagine an Islamic army in ancient times fighting in the jungle like Vietnam. You know, you can imagine people getting on horseback and trying to gallop on horses, teams of horses through the thick jungles. I mean, the briars and thorns would tear the horses and rider to pieces for one thing, but also to create serious impedance. Again, Islamic armies do not do well in mountainous regions or regions where there's a lot of brush and undergrowth. Only in the wide open plains, wide open countries. All right. Oh, yes. One reason that Islam was able to make quick inroads into Egypt. Once Islam had burst out of Arabia, they quickly conquered Persia, but some of them went to Egypt. Egypt had embraced Coptic Christianity. Now, don't ask me about the theology of Coptic Christianity. I do want you to remember the word, though, because the Copts and the Islamic people became friends, and partly because the Coptic Christians had been persecuted by the Byzantines. So Islam took Egypt and Ethiopia, took Egypt from the Byzantines because the Byzantines had persecuted the Coptics. And they became friends and remained friends until very recent times. However, when Islam tried to move south to conquer Ethiopia, Islam was unable to do so. All right. The nation that we now call Axum, the once called Axum is now called Ethiopia. It was once called Axum, same country. Now the Sahara. Sahara Desert today has the hottest temperatures on Earth. Temperatures have been known to get up to 170 degrees. If you're wondering how hot that is, if you will let your car stay parked in a hot sun in July, and then come out to your car around 3 or 4 in the afternoon after it's been outside in the hot sun all day, the temperature inside your car might be up to 160 or 170 degrees, depending on what the materials inside your car are made of or whatever. But that is extremely hot. But it wasn't always that way. At one time, the Sahara Desert was a land of grasslands or savannas, a land of a lot of game. Now, folk, what I'm about to say is somewhat controversial. I mean, what isn't controversial is there was an ice age. The ice age was so bad that it got all the way down as far south as the Ohio River here in North America. The ice sheet covered all this area here. and covered Europe even as far south as the Alps. And at least one winter, it is known that the Mediterranean Sea froze over. Now, some of your books will say that the last ice age ended 10,000 years ago. I personally don't think it was that long, but what I do believe is that during the ice age, humans living in Europe, and probably humans living here south, they were forced to migrate into a land that would support them. So much of humanity might have collected itself here in the Sahara, what is today the Sahara region. And there they found a pretty easy life, a lot of game, a lot of animals. The animals also had to migrate, leave Europe, leave southern part of Africa. Then, when the ice age ended, this area dried up. The desert started out small, it's believed, and got larger and larger and larger and larger. In today's world, your hurricanes start here in the Sahara. A puff of wind, you might say, will join with another puff of wind. Those puffs of wind will join with other puffs of wind. They'll head into the Atlantic, and the winds will pick up their energy from the hot Atlantic waters and eventually find their way west, and sometimes into the United States. Now, most hurricanes that start here in Africa wind up veering north and missing the United States completely. It's been a few years since we had a major hurricane hit the United States. I believe Hurricane Sandy was the last one to do a significant amount of damage. Before that, you had Hurricane Katrina that first went through Florida and then hit New Orleans and did a whole lot of damage. But the hurricanes have their origin here in the Sahara Desert. Now, as the Sahara Desert dried up, they began to figure out how can we trade, because after all, there were a lot of minerals here in this part of Africa the rest of the world wanted. So they began to figure out ways to get across the desert. At first, donkeys were used, but then they found out that the best animal to get across the desert was the camel. Now, we have begun studying the routes, and your book, I believe, has a map of some of the trade routes we found. Even though I don't see it now, but once, oh yeah, there's a map of the trade routes on page 225, and I had a few, but how come they didn't use straight lines? The answer to that is they had to follow the oases, the water holes. They had to know where they'd come to a water hole and had to know where the next water hole was, so they'd spend maybe 2 or 3 days getting there. Around each the water hole, there's an oasis, and oftentimes they put up a small town around the oasis. But they had to follow the water holes, which is why they didn't necessarily go in a straight line here to here. The city of Carthage is believed to have been the point which goods coming from south of the desert would arrive in Europe, and in turn European goods would meet at the city of Carthage to be sent back to the desert to be sold to the Africans. So there was some trade that went on between Africa and Europe, but might have gone through the city of Carthage. The Berber people lived here in North Africa, and they did a lot to participate in the trade. Eventually, the city of Carthage was destroyed, and eventually a lot of Africans' minerals did not find its way to Europe anymore. Now, in Africa, we have found smelting areas where they would smelt iron. And any of you who know anything at all about smelting iron know it's not just a matter of building a fire hot enough. You have to use bellows to put extra oxygen on a flame to get the flame really, really hot. And the bellows, I mean, are big, huge things that might be 5 or 6 feet tall, and the men would press them down and blow air on the flame and get the flame hot enough to even melt iron. They used clay, large clay pots. Why clay? Because clay didn't melt when the iron did. Of course, when the iron melted, the iron being heavier would sink to the bottom and the impurities would go on the top, and somebody had to come along with I'll call it a spoon for lack of a better word, but it's bigger than a spoon, but with a large shovel made of clay also. And they would swoop up the impurities, and then they would oftentimes pour the iron into molds. And then the finished iron product would be sold to merchants who in turn would probably carry it across the Sahara Desert into Europe. But then eventually these iron smelting places shut down as civilization largely died down in Europe, and Europeans could no longer had any gold in which to buy things from Africa, and the whole world went into a period of time called the Dark Ages. I'm talking about after the fall of the Roman Empire, for about 500 years after Rome fell. Now, East Africa, I've already mentioned. These people were eventually taken over by the Bantu. The Bantu became tribal peoples. Or they actually seem to have started out as tribal peoples, but they took over. And most of your people living in this part of Africa today are either completely Bantu or have a large percentage of Bantu DNA in them. We used to say Bantu blood, but now we'll say Bantu. They have a lot of Bantu DNA. And these people at first, again, traded with the Far East, but eventually, as was the case of all African civilizations, or civilization declined. The religion of these peoples was animism, very similar to the religion of the tribal peoples living in the Americas, North America, South America, and the Far East here. And it's hard to tell whether the primitive conditions bring on animism as religion or whether the animism brings on the primitive conditions. It's hard to tell, but one seems to feed on the other. Animism is a worship of nature. They might believe that there was one time a creator God way back there who made everything, but then he made a series of lesser gods, and they would tend to worship these lesser gods in the pantheon. Shamanism also, another word for shaman is witch doctor. Shamanism was a big part of their religion. And in a few minutes I'll remind you that because the Africans had their shamans, this made it difficult for Islam to make any headway, because the shamans are priestly mediators, and Islam insists that there should be no priestly mediators. So this made it difficult for Islam to make any headway. All right, folks, before the word tribe. Oh yes, I must define it again, I guess. The word tribe means an extended family, people who are related by being descended from the same great-great or great-great-great-grandparents. And eventually, as a tribe gets so big, it will split in two. But sometimes a person is taken into the tribe who is not related. As for instance, if a person is captured in war and made a slave, he might decide to join the tribe voluntarily. Or sometimes a person who has committed some kind of a dishonorable act and got kicked out of one tribe might find his way to another tribe, where that if he's decided to change his ways, then he can be accepted in the other tribe. But for the most part, though, the word tribe means related by birth. And speaking of birth, I must mention a lot of African tribal peoples worship their ancestors. Now, it's not just primitive people who worship their ancestors. It's known that a lot of the Greeks did, the Chinese especially did, and some of your European peoples might have done so before Christianity. A lot of persons have worshipped their ancestors in time past. Now, Islam. Islam had an easy time conquering Egypt owing to the persecution of the Coptics. A lot of Egyptians voluntarily converted to the Muslim faith. Now, it seems like it was voluntary. And Egypt became a Muslim country and has remained Muslim to this day from the time Egypt was conquered within 2 or 3 generations after Muhammad. Then from Egypt, Islam spread into North Africa. The Berbers, who by this time had embraced Christianity, they resisted Islam at first, but eventually the Berbers succumbed and all of North Africa became Islamic. And by the way, has remained so to this day. Then when Islam began to spread southward. And they met the Ethiopians whom they could not conquer. This I've already mentioned. But then when they went deeper into Africa, they ran into two big problems when they're dealing with the Africans. Problem number one was the Africans believed in priestly mediators. And they would ask Islam, I mean, I can imagine this conversation, well, where are your priestly mediators? Oh, we have none. You mean, how can one get to Allah without a priest? Well, we believe everybody can go directly to Allah without priest. So the lack of priestly mediators was something the African mindset did not seem to comprehend. But there was another problem. And this is a problem that Christians also had when Christians tried to convert the Africans, the problem of polytheism. Now, polytheism means more than one spouse. And African men were allowed to have as many wives as they chose, and a lot of times African women had more than one husband. Polytheism was an issue, and the Islamic people simply could not figure out a way to deal with it. Yes?
With polygamy?
Polytheism, thank you.
Just as in terms
Yeah, all right, thank you much. I stand corrected. For the word I'm talking about is polygamy. Not polytheism, polygamy. Oh, man. I'm getting old. The word is polygamy. So if you wrote down polytheism, scratch, it's polygamy. Polygamy is a big problem among Africans and has remained so to this day. And the African, the Islamic converts simply did not figure out how to deal with it. And the Christians also, when they went in to try to Christianize African people, they ran into the same problem. Family life in Africa, polygamy was the norm. Polygamy was accepted all over Africa. And it made it difficult for outsiders to come in with their religions. Now, your book talks about some other countries, Ghana, Mali, and Zimbabwe. I don't want you to take a lot of time to memorize. I'll tell you something about the test. Half of it is on Islam. It's going to be true, false, and multiple choice, but all the true, false questions will be about the American Indians. Most of the questions on American will be true, false. Then half of it's going to be on Islam. There won't be a lot in Africa. Don't try to memorize the names of just the one thing I want you to remember about them. All these nations lived here in the western part of Africa, and they all succumbed. And by the time the Europeans found them, these nations were like the Maya. They were still remembered, but pretty far dead, pretty far gone. One area, though, I want to point out was the area of Timbuktu, located along here in what is today Mali. There was an expression that was commonplace when I was a youngster, as far away as Timbuktu. All right, well, where's Timbuktu? And if you look on a map, it may not look on a map to be that far, but actually it's far from everything else. And for many years, when Europeans tried to get there, they were not allowed. Between dry desert, venomous snakes, and some of the snakes in Africa are the deadliest in the world. Between dry desert, venomous snakes, and very high temperatures, and very hostile natives. No European was able to get into Timbuktu for scores of years, but eventually some Europeans did. And in fact, your book shows a picture of the town of Timbuktu. It consists mostly of stone houses, if I can find it. Oh yeah, there it is on page 228 in my book. Town of Timbuktu, mostly stone houses. In the middle, the reason the town was located there is there's an oasis there. That's the reason why all these little towns you see in the desert are all located around water oases. Timbuktu is no exception, but the natives kept Timbuktu at a distance from Europeans for many years. Eventually Europeans would hear of the city, knew it was there, but eventually Europeans were able to get to it. Again, these countries, nations though they were, they fizzled and died. And maybe it was because their people could not find employment and then went out into the jungle to just start life all over again from scratch. Who knows? The requirements of civilization, folk, can be mighty steep. And I'll tell you what, as a young man, I once considered leaving civilization behind and going off into the wild and just seeing what life would be like. I'm so glad I didn't. Some people in the Enlightenment taught that civilization is what had corrupted man, give man back his uncivilized ways and he become peaceful and tame. In fact, this idea got so bad that the Pol Pot, the ruler of Cambodia, killed 1/7 of the Cambodian population of 1 million people. He killed everyone who wore glasses, everyone who was educated, everyone who was professional, just to try to return his country to the ancient primitive ways of animals. And, you know, he learned it from his study in Europe, from the philosophers who liked the Enlightenment. Again, because civilization has a high price. The price of spending years and years in study, getting prepared, picking out the right profession, hopefully you'll get the right job, and then running a risk of unemployment, feeling alone and isolated. I mean, that's the price we pay for civilization. But I recall when I was a child visiting a home and they had a plaque on this home, no matter what the cost of living, it's worth it. And in the end, there is a price. But again, these peoples tended to go downhill. Your book calls these people stateless people, the same word they use to describe the American Indians. Stateless peoples are peoples who live in tribes, do not have loyalty to a state. Now, there is a problem though with stateless peoples. Number one, they have a tendency to be conquered by their stronger and more mighty neighbors. And also, these are the people who were enslaved. Now, slavery, while I'm on the subject. Africa has had a problem with slavery from the very dawn of its history all the way to the present. And there are stories that right here in this region of Africa and possibly here in the Congo, there are still slaves. In the case of Sudan, I mean, it's well documented that the United States Senate discussed the issue. The United Nations discussed the issue of slavery in Sudan. And at one point, a bunch of Americans went in and purchased all the slaves and freed them and thought they were doing a good deed. The Sudanese slave owners said, hey, this is great, look at all the money we made. So they went and recaptured the slaves, and they decided, no, that wasn't the way to handle the problem. Today, eventually, Sudan was split in two because the Sudanese feared the United States would intervene. And Sudan was split in two, with the south being at least nominally Christian and the north being still under Islam. And I am not sure if there's slavery going on in this region right now or not. If any of you know, you're welcome to. I know that it was a problem. But slavery has been an issue. And in some places in Africa, 75% of the people were slaves, or the slaves outnumbered the free people 3-to-1. In some places, number 10%. The slaves living in royal households were the most likely to be the most violently treated. The kings looked really down on slaves as being low. But it's been a problem with Africa from the very beginning. And the the stateless people, the tribal people, were often the ones who would be taken. If any of you watched the movie Roots, it came out about 35 years ago. It told of an African young man who had just achieved manhood. And he was so proud. His parents had given him a house of his own, and his teacher had given him all kinds of instructions. He had just achieved manhood. He went out alone just to hunt, and he was captured by some white slave traders who took him to the Americas, and he wound up in Virginia. Haley was his name. If any of you saw the movie or read the book, it made a bestseller list years ago about an African man who had traced his ancestors back to the slaves who had come from. But again, a lot of your tribal peoples were the ones that tended to be enslaved the most. They were looked on as by outsiders or civilized people as being the more primitive of people. Religion, I've already mentioned a lot of this. They believed that there had once been a creator God who brought forth a whole lot of lesser gods. But something I haven't mentioned, the way they communicate with the gods was through ritual. And a lot of times the ritual involved music. And it consists, of course, of drums and other instruments. Now, I've had some callers who say, I didn't know Africans had the xylophone. Oh, yeah, the Africans we met, when Europeans met them, were descended from more advanced peoples because they would use the drum, the xylophone, and other stringed instruments, the banjo, or what we might call the banjo. They would use these instruments to create the music that would bring the spirits to them. And then they also use shamans to communicate with the spirits. Your book doesn't mention shamanism in this context, but I will. Essentially, a shaman is a person who goes into a trance-like state, often with the help of a drug. Now, folk, again, don't any of you try this. But they go into a trance-like state, and then the visions they see while in this trance-like state, they will believe to be an answer to the questions they ask. About shamans, they're sometimes known as witch doctors or witch men. And remarkably, folk, some of these shaman cures are known by modern medical science to actually be valid as cures or valid treatments for some of their ailments. It's not just complete hogwash, complete fakery. Down through the years, they've learned some things about extracting the right chemicals from certain plants, the right herbs. And I'll say this about herbal medicine, folks. Some of you may know this already. Hundreds of years ago in Europe, herbs was the way that doctors treated ailments. Then we developed drugs, and we thought, oh, herbs is primitive, you know, we don't use herbs anymore. Then we go even farther, closer to modern times, and all of a sudden herbs are making a big comeback. You can go to any drugstore, you'll find a lot of herbs. Be careful with them though, because not all of them are good for you, and some of them have done a whole lot of damage to kidneys or liver functions. So be careful what you take. And the stuff that the federal government has not had time to examine, I would strongly advise leave alone. You'll hear all of these, this is a wonderful herbal supplement, it will cure this, it will make you young again, it will take the wrinkles out of your skin, it will revitalize your heart, it will help you lose weight. Take it with a grain of salt. Yeah.
There's a study about herbal supplements, and a lot of them have like such a minuscule amount that it's like literally one molecule of whatever they're trying to claim. It's quite literally, that's how small it is. They're like, oh yeah.
I'm not surprised to hear you say that. This is consistent with what I've been hearing as independent researchers check on their claims. Yeah, and some of them do wind up getting in trouble with the federal government for making claims that cannot be substantiated. And I ran into this myself one time. Well, I'll name the product. I mean, I guess it's a product called C-Seal that was supposed to contain every vitamin, every mineral you needed in this liquid. It didn't. And the federal government made them pay all of us back, but unfortunately, the man was so broke they wanted to pay back a few bucks of what we had sent to him. I bought a couple of bottles on it myself, about $30 a bottle, actually believing it. This has been about 10 or more years ago, folk. No, I do not take any herbs at all right now. I once did. I wish I hadn't.
The thing to look for in vitamins and stuff is you have to look it up and make sure it's bioavailable. It's like a lot of the daily vitamins and things, it'll have iron or whatever, but it's not a bioavailable source. So yeah, sure, you're taking iron, but you're just like pissing it out. It's not even in you anymore.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah. Does the iron that you take in actually get into your cells?
Yeah, it's got to be.
That's extremely important. Can your body digest it?
Yeah.
Or is it passed out?
Bioavailable.
Yeah.
Look that up.
I mean, hey, some of these herbs are known, they're suspected of being really wonderful and really great and having a lot of validity. And some of them are not worth the paper that's on the bottle. All right, anyway, shaman, witch doctor, a lot of their medicines. The shaman also serves the function of priest, spiritual advisor. Now, African family life It's known that Africans had fewer taboos between the sexes than any other people on earth. Now take that with a grain of salt, because some American Indian tribes, their sexual morals varied from tribe to tribe. Some of the Indians were puritanical, and some of them were much less so. It varied. But in general, African men and women had fewer taboos between them than other groups. Polygamy was the norm, and again, women were allowed to have more than one husband, and men were allowed to have an unlimited number of wives, as I've already mentioned. Now, in African societies, and a lot of them, a man could only pass along the wealth he built up to his sister's children. And folks, I mean, the reason for this is, and the Jews, by the way, do something similar. You cannot become a Jew unless your mother was one. You're not a Jew unless your mother was one. So I had a Jewish friend of mine at Lockheed explain that you always know who the mother is. You don't necessarily know who the father is. So if a man, I mean, if his sister had the same mother he had, then they were considered brother and sister. They might not have the same father, but nevertheless his sister had the same mother. That way he knew that her children were related to him. But what about, you might say, what about his own wife, where he couldn't necessarily be certain that he was the father of the children his wife bore? So he would pass his inheritance on to his sister's children. What about his own children? His own children received inheritance from his wife's brothers. Because that way you could be sure of at least had the female part of the parentage. The male part of the parentage they could not be certain of. All right. Art and music. Mostly art had a religious function. Music, though, had two functions. The African would oftentimes sing about his favorite girl or sing about his favorite deity. The instrumentation consisted of stringed instruments, the drummer, and the xylophone. And African music had a heavy beat. In fact, Africans, when they came to the United States, a lot of times the white persons who were their slave masters would sometimes say, hey, play this music for us, or we want to copy this music. And a lot of African music then found its way into Christian hymn books. In fact, the German preacher Dietrich Bonhoeffer came to Harlem and heard some the Africans sang in their churches, and he said, hey, write down this music and I want to take it back and teach it to my choir, which he did, and taught some of the Germans how to sing African spirituals. Again, a lot of emphasis was placed on a heavy beat, the drum, the stringed instrument, the xylophone. All right, we have about 14 or so minutes left. I want to spend it by way of review, starting with chapter 6. All right, are there Indian mounds in Georgia?
Yes.
Yes, located not too far away, in fact. All right, now the Indian tribes that lived in this part of the country, I mean, don't worry about one name, but your authors lump them into one big word that describes all of them, whether it be Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chippewa, Mohican, I mean, all Indians. There's one word they use to lump them all together, and what's that word?
Cherokee.
Not Cherokee, but woodland. These people are called the Eastern Woodland Indians. As opposed to Indians, for instance, the Pueblo Indians tended to live in what part of North America? Pueblo.
Like in the desert.
And what is the day desert? Yeah, can you name a state, a specific?
Arizona.
What's that?
I'm just kind of guessing Arizona.
Arizona, very good guess. Arizona, New Mexico, primarily New Mexico, but the Indians didn't know the difference, I mean, at that time. So Arizona, New Mexico, desert type. Right here in the southwestern part of the United States lived the Pueblo Indians, and they lived in caves in the rocks high up. I think I mentioned how that you'd better be careful trying to climb up to them, because they knew which sticks were the right sticks to put your weight on, and if you didn't know, you ran the risk of putting your weight on a certain stick that would hold you and falling to your death. So this way they learned the right sticks, and other tribes wouldn't know them, so they protected themselves. Pueblo Indians, eventually drought forced a lot of the Pueblo Indians to leave. Now, the American Indians never invented the wheel. Maybe they didn't need it. They didn't have any beasts of burden. But they didn't have any roads. They never had the wheel. They didn't have the pig, the donkey, the horse, the cow, the sheep, the goat, the ox. The only food animals they had was the ones living here in Peru had the llama. Llamas were used also to carry backpacks, so the only beast of burden they had, a few of them had the llama. Now the Indians did have the dog, but they did not have the house cat. In fact, the only members of the cat family I can think of that lived in America were the jaguar. There might have been some others, wild cats of sort. A few other members of the cat family, none of them that they tamed. No house cats. In the way of plants, they had tobacco, and they had squash, tapioca, potatoes. They gave the whole world potato and corn. They didn't have wheat, rye, oats, barley, none of this. The North American Indians would hunt the deer and the turkey, the elk, and especially here in the Great Plains, the buffalo. It is known that buffalo for a time lived in this region of Georgia before apparently something happened that killed them all off here, and the buffalo went west. But they had the buffalo. Nothing, though, that they tamed except for the dog. All right. Who conquered the Aztecs? Cortez. Who was the leader of the Aztecs by the time Cortez conquered them? Montezuma. Which group of Indians is famous for their calendar? The Maya. Who conquered the Inca? Pizarro. Now, I brought this up in the other class. I think the name Pizarro might have given rise to a character in the Superman books named Bizarro. If any of you ever read the Superman books, he fought a variant named Bizarro. Many of you know who I'm talking about. In the other class, some of them did. I don't think Bizarro is featured anymore in the Superman stories, but he was when I was a kid. But anyway, Pizarro conquered the Incas. There's a bunch of straight lines found in South America called the Nazca lines. All right, leaving the Indians for a while, going on to Islam. Now, folk, I'm surprised at how many college students don't know the next two programs. Who is the founder of Islam? Muhammad. And where was Islam founded? I mean, this should be a really, really easy question. Well, Mecca is a good one. I meant, what I had intended to do was Arabia. Yeah, Arabia. But Mecca is a good enough answer, yes. Where was Islam founded? Founded in Arabia. All right. The holy month for Islam is the month of Ramadan. Muslims pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. For the faces toward Mecca. And they generally, when they can, they pray on carpets. Their first prayer, they carry 2 pieces of thread with them. And the threads are a slightly different color when they can tell which thread is which. I mean, they'll open up the thread in the morning before the sun is really up. And if they can't tell which thread is which, it's not time to pray yet. When they can tell which thread is which, then one color from another, then it's time for them to pray. This is one of their beliefs. And let's see. A holy war is called a jihad. Again, these terms are making news a lot. We hardly even heard of them when I was younger. And let's see. I told you not to worry about the two kingdoms that came along, the Abbasids and the Umayyads. Don't worry about those names yet. You will later. But the two words you do remember. Islam quickly developed into two major factions, and they're still at odds to this day. Which two factions we're talking about? Sunni and Shiite. Generally, I think we get along better with the Sunnis, and the Shiites are more difficult for Westerners to get along with. Hopefully I don't have it backwards. But the issue that separated them was what issue? Succession. You know, who should lead? Who should take over? Let's see. Can you name two stories that have come to us from Islam? Part of their literature. And it's considered high quality literature, by the way. Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. Those are the only two I can think of. I know I've probably read more, but Alibaba and the 40 Thieves and Aladdin are two of the more famous. And actually, the stories are from the book about Arabian Nights, otherwise known as the 1001 Nights. Yes? What's that? Prince of Persia. I'm not sure. I saw the movie, by the way, Prince of Persia. I'm not sure.
Is that actually true? The Aladdin
and the Magic Lamp
were based on Arabian figures from, but I thought were 18th century English additions to those stories.
Oh, okay. I have not followed Arabic literature that closely, but I appreciate that input. All right, now can you name two things that the Arabs invented that both highly beneficial to us? Algebra and the number zero. They also made advances in astronomy and medicine that was to benefit the Europeans later. Algebra and the zero, and again, something else too. They invented Arabic numerals. Without Arabic numerals, you cannot do even arithmetic, much less algebra or geometry. With Arabic numerals, you can teach 9 and 10-year-olds long division and multiplication. They must learn the multiplication tables. I mean, we went through a period of time where all forms of memorization was frowned on, but eventually, I was a member of UT. I was hesitant to tell the professor that I really think they should learn multiplication tables. He's just interrupted and said, they've got to. There's no way around it. They've got to learn their basic addition facts and multiplication. Again, they would be worthless without Arabic numerals. There'd be no reason to learn them. But with multiplication facts, you can multiply numbers with 3, 4, and 5 digits or more. You can't do that with Arabic numerals. I mean, you can't do that with Roman numerals. Or divide a 4-digit number into a 6-digit number. Again, don't try it with Roman numerals. It can't be done. It becomes child's play with Arabic numerals. All right. The Islamic people believe that if they die in a holy war, they go to what happens to an Islamic person who dies in a jihad? Goes into paradise where he has 70 or 72, I don't know which virgins are waiting for him. Generally, Muhammad taught his people that they should not gamble, should not drink wine. The men can only have 4 wives, the women only 1 husband. Casual contact between the sexes was frowned upon deeply. Women were expected to not go outside unless accompanied by their brother or their father, and never be alone with men. Once in their lifetime, they'll go visit the city of Mecca. All right. Where were the Turks from? Very important, because a whole bunch of other people came from that part of the world. Where were the Turks from? Mongolia, Central Asia. Again, I say Central Asia because the area they came from includes more than just Mongolia. Central Asia.